Hi, Irisneri. Welcome to the
Hello.
podcast. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me.
Of course, I'm honored. I was very excited when you asked.
Oh, thank you so much. And so to get started, can you share a little bit about yourself, the healing work that you do, where you're from, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so my full name is Irisneri Alicea Flores. I was born in Puerto Rico and we moved here to Massachusetts when I was 8. But then I was always back and forth. I did go back to the island for college with the hopes of staying. Fortunately, that didn't happen, as many of our stories go. And yeah, I actually went to college for something very different and did my career for almost 20 years in human resources. But my passion was always in history, especially with family history and knowing my family story. Finally, about 10 years ago, I started my research for my family. I just jumped into it, started doing it. And at first I started very, I don't know what's the right word, academically maybe. Like I just wanted to find the names and see what was I going to get and how far I could go. Just kind of started with that. And what occurred was as I started finding my ancestors and finding my paternal grandparents whom I never met, especially my paternal grandmother, I started to feel the healing that started to come with that, with finding out their stories. I started to find out more and understanding so much more about myself. And then and that was just on the personal side. And then going into the history of Puerto Rico and finding out the history of the island, understanding that history that's not necessarily taught, it is not taught to us in school, and understanding more about my people in my community. And just the healing that just started with all of that for me. And then as I started to share with my family and started to see the healing that started to occur within them, it was like I found my purpose. It's like this is I always say all of us in our community, in the Latino community, we always there's a lot. There's a lot in our community. And if we could do it all, we would try.
Yeah.
But we can't. We're not humanly possible we can't do that. There's always a piece, and this is my piece. My
Uh,
piece
Yeah.
is to help my community find their story, and within finding that family history, finding their own healing, finding their own empowerment, because when you find out where you come from and you connect to those roots and you understand so much of the whys, you're empowered also. And so that's where I found my passion. And in 2019, I founded Descubre tu Historia. Um, I became a professional genealogist, and I actually left my human resources world back 2 years ago now.
Wow, so interesting. And I just want to go back to what you shared initially that you're in human resources, and what was your first indication that something needed to change, or not so much
Mhm.
change, but maybe that first seed, or regarding this field, genealogy, what was your first indication that that prompted that curiosity to explore that?
Um, I still have my maternal grandparents. I'm very lucky to have them. I'm very close to my maternal grandmother, and she calls me her colita because I'm always wherever she goes, there I am.
Oh,
Um, and hearing her stories and hearing so many stories that made me help me understand so much about them and their experiences, in turn I understood more about mine. And I realized how much I didn't know about my paternal grandparents, because my grandfather passed when I was 6 and my paternal grandmother passed when my dad was 10. And I mean, my grandmother, who I am, my paternal grandmother who raised my dad, who is my grandma, and I'm named after her, Iris, Abuela Iris. I also realized how much I didn't know about her. And that's when I was like, I wanted to know more. I found that hunger to finally say, you know what, it's time. Because as we have probably found in many cases, people don't really talk about the hard stuff. And when it came to them and to her, I wasn't hearing outside of her name, I didn't know anything else.
And you mentioned some of the healing that has happened in a personal way as you
Yeah.
started this research and as you've been able to get to know your grandparents and your paternal lineage. What is it in just what is the healing that you've seen, and in what ways has it manifested in your life?
Oh, wow. It's been quite a journey. I'm gonna get emotional. I'm getting a little
Yeah.
emotional.
Yeah.
Um, you know, for me, I'm very close to the women in my family, and I knew I didn't have a story with my paternal grandmother, and I always wondered about her and what would have been like. And I know after now I know she's a woman that went through a lot, suffered domestic abuse. She was abused as a child too. I understood now so many of my own traumas in my family that I grew up experiencing, so many different fears and things like that that I didn't understand where they were coming from. And I found that through understanding my grandparents, finally through these documents, and also my grandfather, who was, the abuser, and when it came to my grandmother, I also got to understand him. I saw what happened in his life that broke him. And I understood my dad. I found an empathy for my dad. I saw the son. I didn't see my dad, the strict dad, the dad that, there were certain things that happened that just were hard and created, issues within myself. But I saw the son, and by seeing the son helped me understand him so much. And that's just like I could breathe easier. I found a way. And that's for me, that's when the healing really started. And it made me so curious about, everything else from my family to Puerto Rico to my community.
Yeah, so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with me. And so it sounds like it's almost like just the awareness of
Mm,
knowing what happened to your grandparents, what they went through, and that awareness, understanding that in and of itself, being able to sit with that and integrate that knowledge. It sounds like the energy of that somehow helped soothe how you experience your father, how you saw him as a human,
right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because then I started hearing the stories finally from him. He finally started to open up, and I heard more about her. That's how I learned a lot about her hard experiences I had not known about. And and I understood him better. I mean, he tells me, like, I know since I was very young, my dad keeps a shoebox that he used to for shining shoes. So he would take the ferry from Cataño in Puerto Rico to San Juan as a 6-year-old to buy medicine for my grandmother. And so I'm looking, and I found this out around the
Oh
same
my
time.
goodness. Yeah.
Yeah, I found this out around the same time that my son was around the same age. And he,
Mm.
in many ways, like instruction, like I looked at him, he's very little, like what I expect my dad was like. So when I looked at my son, I just saw my dad. And it really changes how you look at your elders. And to be able to understand your elders, you're not looking to justify, but to understand the better, it's a healing and empowerment that we all need. And it's what got me into this road and finally here.
Yeah, no, that is so beautiful. And I think that when it comes to genealogy, there's this the what we think about when we hear that term is more of the historical organization of your family, right? To put things in order, and
Mhm.
the facts, the story. But what you're describing is more of uh, the intangible ways that putting the story together, it's almost like energetically it's able to provide so much comfort and healing to you as a person doing the research and putting it together, and then also indirectly you're almost transferring that healing to your dad, right? And almost like
Yeah.
sending it back to your previous generations, almost like you're sending the healing back and forward, with your own children.
Yes.
So
Oh yeah.
powerful.
Yeah. It with them, that's one thing. It has changed even the way I parent. It's changed the way I opened up to myself to others. I mean, before genealogy, before all of this, I even considered myself an antisocial person.
Yeah.
But it's helped me just take that fear that would hold me back and bring it with me, and despite that fear, and just do what I love, and take the chances with what I by quitting my full time, take the chances by opening my heart to people that I otherwise would not have opened my heart to.
I think it was sometime last year. I read a book that I thought it was more on the energetics of ancestral healing, but it turned out to be a book on genealogy, or actually a genealogist perspective on ancestral healing. And one of
Mhm.
the things, and I wanted to ask your perspective on this.
Right.
So, one of the things that she mentioned that she experienced is that as she was collecting stories, and as she went on to work with other folks and other families, uh, people, as you start collecting stories, people start having dreams of their
Yeah.
ancestors. They start somehow, a lot of synchronicities, a lot of, sometimes like random people would say, or folks in the family that you haven't talked to in years randomly would message, hey, I have a picture of your great great grandma, and she mentioned how these things tend to coincide with
Mhm.
your research. So I thought that was so fascinating, because one thing is for you to do research and actively make things happen. And then another thing is to have these dreams and these people coming to you with information and stories that you have not solicited. So I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts about that? If you've experienced that yourself or with the clients that you work with?
Definitely on a person. Yes, it's made me so connected to my ancestors. I would, for me, it manifests. I see it a lot with dates and numbers. I will pick a random ancestor to work on, and for example, one day I wanted to work on my grandfather a little more, try to find a document I had not found, and it was his birthday. It was his
Wow.
birthday.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot, even with my clients. When I am working on a story and finding or working on their ancestry, and I'll look at a date, I'm focused on this ancestor, and I'll look at the date and it's their birthday. And it always around that's my way. I feel like that's how ancestors communicate with me, and
Hmm.
their way of letting me know, "Yep, you're on the right track."
Hmm.
That's how I feel, because it happens all the time. I remember one night I randomly, because now that I help so many other people, I barely get to touch my own tree anymore. So one day out of nowhere, it was 11:30 at night. I'm like, you know what? Let me jump on the Aliceas for a little bit. I haven't done it in a long time. And I broke through a wall with the Aliceas that I had not. And I found my fourth great grandfather, Pilar Alicea, who was a Pardo Libre. And it was his birth date.
Oh,
It
wow.
was so
Yeah.
that is always how I feel, how they tend to communicate with me, and it
Yeah.
happens all the time, and it's always coinciding with numbers and dates.
Wow, that's so interesting because it's beyond just what we think about, right? Like I said, with research, it's like there's something bigger than the research that you're doing, almost like guiding
Yes,
your research. Wow, that's so
definitely.
fascinating. And how do you, when it comes, let me just backtrack a little bit. For the last couple of years, I've been very interested in connecting with my ancestors, connecting with especially my maternal. It started with my maternal lineage, and now it seems like my paternal lineage is what's speaking to me at this
Mhm.
point. Uh, and I have not done any kind of genealogical research. It's been
Right.
more on a spiritual in a spiritual path.
Oh,
But
yeah.
how do you how do you see both the genealogy and the ancestral healing? How do you see these two go hand in hand? Or does it just do you have to if someone's interested in doing this, do they have to take separate steps for each, or would it be naturally both just kind of go together?
I think naturally both go together. I think some people start like you, feeling that need to spiritually connect, and then move on to what I do. And then there's like me, where I just started first with genealogy, but I think eventually both just inevitably me. I think with genealogy, you see the names. You see a lot. It's gonna it just, I mean, I haven't seen a case where it just hasn't happened yet. Somebody tells me, "Oh, I feel like I have always felt connected to my indigenous side. I feel like, there's there's a like there's something that I feel like I'm more the indigenous. I want to know, but I don't know anything." I mean, some people don't know anything. Or some people will be like, "I have no idea, but about my story, but I've always been perfect example, actually. This person has always felt connected to Mexican culture and to her but she was not even sure if she was Mexican because she was not brought up with that side of the family. So she even had doubts whether she was, but she always felt this strong sense of being Mexicana. And come to find out, she is very much, very
Oh,
much. And
yeah.
just even that, or somebody saying, "I feel like I'm very connected to the indigenous roots in Arecibo in Puerto Rico," and come to find out, we're connecting, we're starting to
Mm,
connect there. It's just one of these things that spiritually you feel, but then genealogy helps you find those names and find those stories. Are you going to find all those stories? Unfortunately, no. But the fact that you're able to, I always felt a very strong connection for me, very strong connection. Puerto Rico, it's always been very spiritual with me, my experience with Puerto Rico. It's always been more for me about the land. Like ever since I was a little girl, I'm barefoot all the time. And if I'm in Puerto Rico, it's like I have to walk barefoot. I have to feel the land. I never knew why. And doing my genealogy, I have very strong roots in Caguas that go back. And it
mhm.
turns out a lot of my indigenous, especially DNA, has helped me confirm a little bit, comes from that area. And it helped me
Wow,
understand, oh,
yeah.
okay, so it's not me. I
It
mean,
makes
it's in
sense.
me. It makes
Yeah.
sense. Or my African ancestry roots. I'm one that I hear those drums and
Mm,
it comes to me, and I somehow know the dance it because I didn't really grow up. It's funny, I didn't grow up dancing bomba or hearing bomba much.
mhm,
I grew up hearing mostly plena in my
mm,
side of the family. But I hear that bomba music and it's like I naturally know
mm,
I found my enslaved ancestors.
mm.
They're
Wow.
there.
Yeah.
And so and I know their names, Jose Andino, Reyes Ayala, Matilde Ayala. and knowing, okay, that's where that's where it's coming from,
Mm.
and knowing that it's just very special. And to say the names of those ancestors that I think otherwise were meant to be forgotten, which is the truth.
Yeah. Wow. So interesting, so fascinating. And I'm wondering, one of the things that and I'm sure you hear this a lot, but I always think, well, if I was to start any kind of research on my family, I probably wouldn't find anything, right? I always, because people don't keep records, or I'm talking about my family is from Mexico, so I would have to physically be over, so I almost like just shut that down in terms of the historical research. And I'm sure you get that a lot. What do
Oh yeah.
you say to people that, like me, that think you're probably not gonna find anything, so why even bother? Well, what do you say?
It's so funny because that was me 10 years ago. That was one of the apps, that was one of the things that stopped me from, also one of the many layers, but that was one where I thought, no, we were colonized. We probably lost so many documents. If there was something we would know. Come to find out, I mean, I found La Sociedad Puertorriqueña de Genealogía, which has been around for 34 years. They've done amazing work to preserve our stuff. And then there's places like Family Search, Family History Library. So I get in here and then there's church records. There's civil registration records, which is birth, marriage, and death records after when they're kept in the government level. And then before that, it was church records. And they're there on Family Search, on Ancestry, mostly Family Search. And so when people say that, it's like, yes, information is out there. We just have to, we have to just look. And I think that's one of the things I do now a lot too, apart from doing research for others, because I know there's others that want to do their own, is letting them know, look what's out here. This is where you can find this. Like, I might be doing too much because I try to cover all the Latino. I think we all need it. And because yes, information is out there. Is there more information for other countries than yes, it can vary. Depending on, I know for Cuba, it can be a little bit harder and there's different strategies for Cuba. But Mexico, for example, I've worked a lot in Jalisco, I'm in Guanajuato now and Chihuahua. And Jalisco, I've been able to identify pretty much every time I work in the Jalisco area, I explode to like eighth grade grandparents.
Oh, that's so
I mean,
funny. Okay, yeah.
I've seen records that go back to the 1600s.
Oh my goodness. My grandparents are from Jalisco. That's why I was like, that's so funny that you're bringing up Jalisco. As I'm saying, it's impossible.
Yes. When
Oh
somebody
my
comes and tells
goodness.
me they're from
Yeah,
Jalisco, I'm like, okay, so
it's possible.
it's possible, yes.
So fascinating. Wow. Okay. So, when someone, wants to work with you, what are some of the first things that you do as a genealogist? What are the things that, as a client seeking your service, what would I have to come forward with? What do I need to already have to provide to you so you can start your research?
Absolutely. So one of the things that is it's helpful to know. First, I like to meet with the people. I love to meet with people, Zoom, get to know them. I mean, it's very important for me to them to trust me. If this is, I take this very seriously. I mean, your family becomes my own. The names of these families. I've done 40, I think now 41, over 41 investigations, and somebody can tell me a name and I can probably say, okay, wait a minute, let me go onto this tree. They become that familiar to me. And so I like to talk to them face to face first and get to know them, get to see where is they're leaning towards. Like you just said, you're being called to your paternal side. So I'll be like, okay, so let's focus on that. And then once we decide, normally it's good to have as much as possible always, but at least if you have grandparent information, your parent information, grandparents information as far as dates of birth and the where, um, death date and where, marriage date and where, approximate years is okay. It doesn't have to be exact. You don't have to have all of that, at least some of that. If you have all of it, great. Yeah, their children, if there's information on children, where did they work? What do you know about them? Basically, I would anything that you know about them, and then I usually take that and I do a preliminary research to help to make sure that the information is out there before I officially get started with anybody. So I do like a research plan. And then based on, okay, yep, I found I can do this. I can go into these collections. These collections are available. Then that's when we move forward and they become a client and yeah, and we get started and we work for a while.
So that was my next question. Approximately how long does it take for someone to say, okay, this is I have the information that I need. My tree is more or less complete, I feel satisfied. You know, how does that process in terms of a time frame? How does it look like? What are we
I
talking about?
I do communicate very regularly with my clients, so it can vary. Um, there are clients I have worked with for a couple years at this point, because their lines have exploded. I mean, I have a person where I was able to go up to her. It's rare. I mean, it's not like super common, but I did go up to her 12th great grandparents in some case. And
You
so
12th grade, you mean 12.
1500s.
Oh my goodness. So 12 generations
Yeah. So
before. Wow, that's
in her
amazing.
Yeah, in her case, I was able to identify the ancestor that came from Spain, in this case to Mexico.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah, it can vary because sometimes you have to dig into a lot into the historical. I mean, you always have to do historical research along with it, especially when we start hitting the mixed lines, and we because that historical research helps, fill in a lot of some of the blanks. And yeah, so it can vary. One grandparent, so I go by grandparent. I think one grandparent can take me up to 6 months, depending how far I go. On average, I get to fourth to sixth grade grandparents. And then there's the exceptionals where I might go beyond.
Yeah. Yeah, 12 generations. That is
Yeah.
that is crazy to think that there's records available that far back, right? And yeah,
Yes.
okay. It's also encouraging. For me, I think the more I learn about my my ancestors, my first of all, just even my grandma, my both of my grandmothers have been gone for a very long time, so I didn't really get to connect with them in the way that I would now that I'm an adult, right? When you're young and you're just going about your life as a young person. So I didn't have the perspective that I have now when they were alive.
I hear
But
you.
it's so amazing to me how I still keep learning things without really making deliberate research effort, and how interesting I'm just fascinated right now about learning how they lived, how they experienced the world in their time, whether it was the 50s, the 60s. Um,
Yes.
and for folks out there that may be thinking, because I know I've gotten this too, from some people in my family. They're like, okay, well, if you find out X, Y, and Z, then what? It's like, what do you do with that? Um, what would you say to that? And I know we talked about the generational healing component, right? That you do
Hmm.
feel energetically a shift happening. But what would you say to those people that are so, maybe just not open to learning about, whether it's me, my family members, and I'm sharing with them, well, this is what I want. This is what I'm learning, and they're just like, no, well, what's the point of that, right? What would you say to
Right.
those folks that are just so closed off to learning about where they come from and their ancestors?
I think when it comes to those folks, especially our elders, I give them a lot of grace. I've learned to give a lot of grace because I know they lived lives where they weren't taught to speak, to do the hard conversations. They lived lives where it was just about the go, doing what you have to do to get your family forward. especially coming to a country where you didn't know your language, didn't know the language, and or they had so much trauma back home, or leaving home. I mean, I know for me, even for me, because I can understand it in a sense, because for me it was always hard sometimes to talk about Puerto Rico and how I feel about Puerto Rico, so I would just keep it in. Now, of course, I talk about it more openly. It's hard to talk about home when you want to be home, when that's part of you that wants to be there. So what I usually do with them is, especially because I have some of those in the family, I've let them know, oh, this is what I'm working on. And there's always going to be those few that are going to start asking questions, that even if they were the ones, they're going to be like, oh, okay, but oh, and it's funny because then when you start telling them what you find, that triggers memory and stories start to come. So be ready with, I mean, if you can't record them, be ready, because stories will start to come. And there are those that will probably stay closed off to it for X or Y reason. And I think now, learning so much about my own ancestors, my own grandparents, and knowing their stories, understanding my dad's story, I understand now there's just things I don't know about. And I might be, there's just something that I might be triggering without knowing that I'm doing it. So I do tend to be more gentle when it comes to those folks.
Yeah,
And just,
absolutely.
yeah, and just be more, just by granitos. I do by granitos
Mm-hmm.
and see, and don't try to push it. But I do find more often than not that they eventually start asking questions and coming forward and, oh, what did you, oh, wait, I remember this. Did you find this? That's how they'll start. Oh, did you find the name? Oh, wait, yeah, I knew that person. And then stories start to come. But yeah, that's what I've learned with this journey. Because I mean, even with my own grandfather, my maternal grandfather, he he lost his father when he was 4. Yeah, it's very tragic. His father committed suicide. And I only saw my grandfather as my grandfather, the quiet man, very sweet. Um, and I show him his dad's death record because he wanted to see it. I said, Abuelo, I found it. And he said, oh, okay. And then when he told me he wanted to see it, I showed it to him. And it said that his dad was a chauffeur. And just that one detail that wasn't tied to the way his
Yeah,
father died, that's all he knew. And I saw the emotion in him.
yeah,
That was that's one of, it was like, okay, you never really know all these traumas they experienced. And that was another, going back to the question of how they show you signs. When I'm from Bayamon in Puerto Rico, which is a metropolitan area up north, and my grandfather's family's from Cabo Rojo. I'd never been to Cabo Rojo before. I was always in the metro area. Um, and I decided for vacation I was going to stay in Cabo Rojo. I randomly chose Joyuda. Never heard of Joyuda before, but I decided to stay there. That is where my great grandfather passed.
oh my goodness. Yeah.
And my grandfather started to get emotional. He's like, "You're staying in Joyuda." And I'm like, "Yeah, abuelo, right on the beach." And he says, "That's my great grandfather went to the beach, and that's where he." So, I made sure to go onto the beach, think of him, and do that for him.
Absolutely. Wow, so beautiful. And at the same time is it's almost like what's coming to mind is what an honor and privilege for us for to be able to have the ability, the even the thought to do this,
Mhm.
right? For our
Yeah.
ancestors, the thought of even thinking of doing this, like what you shared, going to the beach and honoring his memory. And that there is, I think there's a certain privilege and honor that we have to even have this conversation about our ancestors, right?
I
And so
know.
many generations
Yes.
before us, it wasn't even a thought to have. You mentioned a little bit just being, just taking care of, they're just taking care of their family, survival
Yeah.
mode. And
Survival, which
yeah,
we all know. I think our DNA has that
yes,
embedded in it. And we all wonder why. We're always on hypervigilance. We're always like, why? That's why.
always working. What's next, right? Having a hard time resting and
Yep.
being being still, doing nothing. It's hard for us. And yeah, like you said, when you realize where you come from and how they have lived up to this point. I mean, I'm thinking just as far as my parents, right? It's like, well, no wonder I have such a hard time with the concept that, well, I can just relax tonight instead of, okay, what's next to do? What am I missing? Feeling guilty for even taking a break.
Yes, I know. And
Yeah.
I'm actively working on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to thank you for sharing your wisdom, your
Oh,
story
thank
with
you.
us, and I want to thank your abuelitos and abuelitas for showing up and for you and for you to be able to share their story now with me and the folks listening, because I think there's so much medicine in those stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I think we need it. I mean, for many reasons, we all have a story different. I mean, I think we all have a lot in common, but at the same time, we have our unique stories. And our community is a community that needs to learn to start talking about the hard things. And I do think genealogy is another way to facilitate those hard conversations. It's another element um, that needs to happen because it opens up the doors to the history that we need to be aware of too. As an empowered community, informed community, we're empowered by information, and that's empowering to know our history. And I think it's extremely important to do that. So it's one of the many reasons why I do this.
yeah, no, it's beautiful, and thank you for the work that you do and the healing
Thank
that
you.
you're bringing to our community. Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you.
And it is before we end our combo, how can folks find you for those that would love to learn more about you and the work that you do? How can people find you?
Okay, so I do have my website, which is descubretuhistoria.com. You can also find me in Instagram and Facebook. Uh, it- yeah, and I have my email list. You can sign up to my email list through my website, and my Instagram has the link tree that also links you into to do my email list. And I also recently just started a private Facebook group, Descubre tu Genealogy, and that's where I'll be sharing a little more in detail about research and where to find things. I mean, I do that a lot in my platform, but here it's going to allow me to just focus more on that, especially for those folks that really want to know a little more and want to do their own research. So,
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'll include those links in the show notes.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well,
Thank you.
again, thank you so much for being willing to share with us today. And I look forward to connecting with you again in the near
Thank
future.
you. Yes,
Yes,
yes. This was awesome. Thank you so much.
absolutely. Thank you.